Okay, so the final case study on overpopulation is this one here. It's the Aral Sea in Central Asia. And this is different from the other two because it does not involve population growth. So the reason why overpopulation is happening here is because of resource depletion. So there is the Aral Sea. It is halfway between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and that is the resource that we're talking about. It's very interesting because it's an endorheic lake, which you don't really need to know, but anyway, it means that it's a lake where the water doesn't drain into the sea. So the rivers come into the lake and they just end there. So it doesn't drain into the sea. So that's called endorheic, but again, you don't really need to know that. This was once the fourth largest lake in the world, and it provides the entire area with a source of water, but also a source of food in the form of fish, but mostly it provides a source of employment because it supported a thriving fishing industry with thousands of people in the area involved in fishing, from basically direct fishing to fish processing to transporting the fish to the canneries to fish net industries, boat yards, etc., etc. Okay, so the resource that's been depleted is the Aral Sea, and basically since the 1960s it's been shrinking and shrinking over time. So if you have a look here is the Aral Sea in the 1960s, and here is the Aral Sea in 2009. So this is what you're looking at here is the outline of the Aral Sea, and this is all the water that's left in it. So in the space of 50 years, it's almost been completely depleted to about 10% of its original size. And you can see that this happened gradually, where the coastline was moving back and back and back until it got to this point here. So why was this resource depleted? Well, I want you to pay attention to these here. So this is the River Seir, and this is the River Amu. And basically these are the two largest rivers which feed and sustain the lake. So these rivers flow into this lake. Like I said, it doesn't go out to the sea, and they feed this with the source of fresh water. So if anything happens to this river, then the source of fresh water for the lake disappears as well. And this is exactly what's happened. So again, I want you to pay attention. Darya just means the word river. So here's the Amu and here's the Seir, okay? And what happened is that in the 1960s, this was on Soviet land, and the Soviet government diverted the rivers. So they built dams across the rivers, and they used the water to provide irrigation for farming. And so by 1965, the Amu basically was stretched across 7 million acres of wheat and cotton. And there's the Amu there. These are extremely hungry crops. So the Amu would have come in from this direction here, and the Soviet government diverted the water from the River Amu in order to provide irrigation for wheat and cotton. And because of this, then a huge source of its water was lost, and it started to shrink back. Okay, so overpopulation occurred because the lake could no longer support the population of the region with food, with water, or with employment. The effects were a lack of resources. The two main resources that were affected were water and food, so fresh water and fish. And the other main issue was unemployment. So tourism and the fishing industry completely collapsed because obviously they were both dependent on being at the lake, and the lake is now gone. And as a result of that, people migrated outwards and went to seek employment somewhere else. Okay, it also had negative health effects on the region because as the water dried up, pollution and sewage became concentrated in the remaining water, and pesticides from agriculture built up, and these have all been left behind in these huge salt flats. And when it's dry, the wind can pick up the dust from these salt flats, and there's chemicals there as well because there's pesticides gone into it, and blows it over the area, and there's been an increase in throat cancers and lung diseases. So these are just some aerial images. So in 1989, flourishing lake and completely dried up here. Okay, these are images from the region. These are just boats that were left, and it's almost desert. So it's mad to think that these would have been like in a massive big lake, the fourth largest lake in the world, The villages and the towns surrounding the lake were just abandoned because people couldn't earn a living, and they just left, and everything was abandoned there. And again, the fishing boats that would have supported a thriving commercial fishery have just been left and abandoned there. This is quite poignant. So this is Moyniac. So Moyniac was one of the biggest towns along the Aral Sea, and this would have had, basically people there would have been employed in tourism, and they would have been employed in fishing. So it was like a resort town for people in this part of the world. They would have come here on their holidays, and the other form of income was the fishing industry. So about 30,000 people in this town were employed in fishing, and this marked it was located right along the coastline. So this is a memorial now saying basically here stood the town of Moyniac, and this used to be the shoreline of the lake. So this would have been the entrance to Moyniac. Still a few buildings scattered there, but where there used to be water, there's now just dry sands. I'll show you this clip and then we'll come back to it.
There used to be fish, tens of thousands of tons of fish, and now there's a camel.
So she's driving through the lake.
There's been this claim that the garment industry is the second worst polluter.
Now, she's talking about, I didn't pause that very flatteringly on her. She's talking about the garment industry because a lot of the reason why this lake is no longer there is because the rivers were used to grow cotton, which is then used for clothes. So garments are clothes.
In the world. I find that utterly staggering. Disaster took place at the Aral Sea, and that's where I'm heading now. So this is a map of the Aral Sea, quite impressive, even on a screen. Enormous, like half the size of England.
We are driving on the seabed now.
Right now?
Used to be the bottom of the lake, but they're driving now.
We have been driving for half an hour.
Half an hour. So that gives you an idea of the scale of the problem here. And to the right of us, that
used to be the coastline.
Okay. Right. So what they're saying is up here was the coast. So that was the level. So down here, they're at the bottom of the lake bed. So you can see like the volume of water that's disappeared out of it.
Is that camel? Are they camels?
Yes, camels.
I feel like this portrays perfectly what's gone on here.
It's a lot of water.
I'm stood now, I would be at the bottom of the seabed and there would be sea all around me.
Yes, exactly. Now we are standing on the former sea.
And how many meters higher would the sea
It
be?
used to be about 5 meters deep here. Now nothing.
Okay, so you can get the idea fairly clearly from the images in that video. So the effects are fairly obvious. They did try to survive for a little while. So if we take the town of Moyniac here, which was the one I was talking about earlier, as the water started to dry up, what they did initially was that as the lake edge moved further and further away, they dug canals from the town to the smaller kind of lakes, and then they tried to keep catching fish, and they used the canals to get in and out. Eventually the edge of the lake was so far away from the town that they had to use helicopters to get the fish. So this would be where the fish processing plants were. So if they were catching any fish, they had to use helicopters to transport the fish from the lake back to the town. And eventually it shrunk so far back that it wasn't worth their time to do this anymore because it was costing them too much money. Another problem that happened here was that because it's shrunk so much, like large bodies of water like this act as a climate controller in a region, and because it's shrunk, it's had the result of hotter summers and colder winters, and the hotter summers have given this desert effect in the area as well. I think that's all the effects. I'll go through it in your booklets in a minute. Right, the main solution then. So how do they reverse this, or how do we try save the Aral Sea? Well, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1997, and the Soviet powers were removed, they could actually make the first move to try and save the north part of the Aral Sea. So the Aral Sea is now divided into the North Aral Sea and the South Aral Sea. They're not going to be able to save all of it, so they've concentrated on the North Aral Sea. And so the government of Kazakhstan built a permanent dam that was designed to raise the water levels by about 4 meters. And this then would have the effect of reducing the amount of salt, so we could get in more fish species. Within 8 months of having done this, the water had reached the top of the dam, so it was very, very successful. Native plants have grown back and some species of fish have returned. Enough species of fish have returned so that commercial fishing is possible again. And the people who out-migrated before came back because they now had employment. So they managed to reverse it slightly. So if you have a look at this here, predicted shoreline 2025. Here is the dam that's been built. So there's a dam here, and there's a reservoir here, and a dam here, and they've got gates inserted basically to control the flow of water. So massive engineering could help the southwestern Aral. Water losses along the Amu irrigation channels, so this is down here, would have to be reduced and structures built as shown. The plan would improve the local climate and provide valuable grounds for birds and aquatic mammals. Outflow towards the eastern basin would freshen the western basin, carrying more salt out than is brought in. So one massive problem here is that this is a freshwater lake, but as the size of the lake reduced and there's less water in it, then there's a build-up of minerals, and mainly there's a build-up of salt. So as the lake shrunk in size, it became more salty. And the problem with this is that if it becomes more salty or more saline, then the fish can't live in it anymore. So you have less fresh water being fed into the lake by the rivers, more evaporation, salts build up in it, and the lakes became salty as they became smaller. And this led to all 24 native species of fish disappearing, and this was the main reason why commercial fishing disappeared. Alright, and then this is just another view of the North Aral Sea. And the North Aral Sea is the sea where they have had most success in bringing it back into life, but the South Aral may eventually end up drying up completely. Right, now before we do that, I just want to read through this in your notes because that was relatively short. And this is a little bit more complicated than the other one. So if you go to page 67, and it's that should be case study 3, the Aral Sea in Central Asia, not 2, so we can change that. Right, the main cause here, let's just get this up and we'll do causes, solutions, etc. So Aral Sea, and whoops, I am going to read through this in your notes as well, so I need you to read along with me. So the cause is resource depletion, okay, and the main reason for that is the rivers, water taken from rivers, for irrigation, and this then led to the sea drying up. Okay, so page 67, resource depletion means using resources up. This then means that there's not enough resources left for the existing population. Overpopulation caused by resource depletion occurred in the Aral Sea in Asia. So let's just think about that for a minute. When the Aral Sea was at its full extent, it was able to support the population to an adequate standard of living. When the Aral Sea shrunk, it could no longer support the population because there was less fresh water, less food, and less jobs available. Okay, and that's the basics of overpopulation. The Aral Sea is a lake in Central Asia. It was once the 4th largest lake in the world and provided the area with a natural source of water. In the 1960s, the Aral Sea supported a thriving fishing industry with thousands of fishermen earning a living from it. Many more found employment in fish processing plants, so that's basically where they just process the fish, like Donegal catch or something. Canneries is like where you put tuna in tins, so they're basically canning the fish. And the railroad yards where trainloads of fish were transported to the markets every day. However, since the 1960s, the Aral Sea has been shrinking. The depletion of this resource came about because the waters of the two largest rivers, the Amu and the Seer, which flow through the desert and feed the Aral Sea, were diverted through canals by the Soviet government to provide irrigation for farming in the surrounding areas. So basically the water was taken out of the rivers no longer brought fresh water to the lake. By 1965, the Amu stretched across 7 million acres of wheat and cotton, two of the plant's thirstiest crops. Basically means they require huge volumes of water to grow them. Eventually, the Amu drew back from the Aral Sea and now no longer reaches it. Without its source of water, the Aral Sea was reduced to less than 10% of its original size. Overpopulation has occurred because the Aral Sea can no longer support the population of the region with food and water or employment. That's really important, that sentence there. So overpopulation has occurred because the Aral Sea can no longer support the population of the region with food, water or employment. Tourism and the fishing industry were dependent on the Aral Sea, and these have collapsed. Many people were forced to migrate to seek employment elsewhere. And turning over, an example of this is the town of Moynick, which was once located on the edge of the lake. It was a coastal resort, which also employed 30,000 people in the fishing industry. It's now 100 kilometres away from the coast and has become a desert town. Drinking water is another natural source which can no longer support the population. Any remaining water is contaminated with pesticides and agricultural waste from the surrounding plantations. Right, effects then. Shrinking of lake, loss of fresh water, fish species, loss of source of employment, so that would have been fishing industry and tourism. And other effects then would have been negative health effects, and we'll go through those. Okay, so page 68, effects: lack of water, food and employment, and health issues. Overpopulation has occurred around the Aral Sea as a result of the government policy to divert water from the Aral Sea. This resulted in the shrinking of the Aral Sea to less than 10% of its original size. Without this resource, the water, food and employment are no longer adequate for the population. So lack of employment came about as the commercial fishing industry could no longer survive. As the Aral shrank, it receded. So receded meant it pulled back, or it kind of moved away from its harbours. Initially, the fishermen had to dig deep canals to get the ships into the ports, and later helicopters were used to get the catch to processing plants. So does that make sense? Oh, where's my page gone? Oh no. Anyway, we'll start a new one. Sorry about that. So, where was I? Second paragraph. As the Aral Sea receded from harbours, so first of all, they had to dig canals because the ships could no longer sail to the port, so they had to build canals to get them in, and then later they used helicopters. As less fresh water entered the lake from the rivers, the lake became more salty. Eventually all 24 species of native fish disappeared and the fishing industry collapsed. Many of the fishermen abandoned their ships and moved to fisheries elsewhere, and you saw those ships abandoned in those clips. An example of this is the town of Moynick, which was once located on the edge of the lake, coastal resort employing 30,000 in fishing, now 100 kilometres away from the coast, and it's deserted. The remaining population struggled to feed themselves as the environment became more difficult. When the Aral Sea was its original size, it acted as a climate controller, and as it shrank, summers got hotter and winters got colder. The health of the population has been affected as the water dried up, pollution and sewage became concentrated in the remaining water, and pesticides from agriculture built up. So basically, if you've got a really big lake, it can kind of absorb all of these pollutants, but if you've got a really small lake, then it can't. So they're built up and they become more concentrated. When it dried up eventually, all of those pollutants and chemicals got left beside in huge salt flats. Dust storms in the area disturbed the salt and chemicals and spread them over hundreds of kilometres. Throat cancer and lung diseases became more common, and infant mortality rose to 60 in 1,000. Now that is absolutely huge. If you think that we said for Sudan infant mortality was 58, and that's in the Sahel in sub-Saharan Africa. So infant mortality was higher in this region here than it was in Sudan. With the absence of fish, people were also lacking in protein. Drinking water supplies were reduced, and much of the remaining water was contaminated with pesticides and agricultural waste. So solutions then. Sorry, the other white screen disappeared on me. So building dams. Okay, that's the main solution. Whoops. Building dams to conserve the water. Alright, so page 68, bottom. Solution, dam was built. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, steps were made to save the North Aral Sea. By 2005, the World Bank and the government of Kazakhstan had designed and built a permanent 8-mile or 13-kilometre dam intended to raise the North Aral by about 13 feet or 4 metres. This would be deep enough to reduce salinity, so the saltiness, so that fish could survive in it. Within 8 months, water had reached the top of the dam, native plants had grown back, and enough fish returned to make commercial fishing possible again. Middle-aged men and women who left the region when they were young have started to return for fishing. However, the South Aral continues to shrink and may eventually dry up completely. Alright, so this then is a summary of everything we've done so far. Here are the 3 case studies. Like I said, ordinary level, you'll probably be okay with just Sahel and Sao Paulo. Higher level, you'll need all 3. And let's just run over this very quickly. So in the Sahel, the causes population growth and resource depletion. In Sao Paulo, the cause is population growth. I'll fix that actually. Hang on a sec. No, I don't. Let's go back in here. Copy that. Okay. So, and alright, so Sahel causes population growth and resource depletion, but here the population growth is because of high birth rates mostly. In Sao Paulo, caused population growth, but here the population growth is because of migration. In the Aral Sea, the population didn't change, but there was less resources. Okay, effects in the Sahel. The main resources that were affected were soil and food and kind of water through climate change. In Sao Paulo, the main resources that are affected are the resource of having shelter, proper shelter, clean water, electricity, etc. In the Aral Sea, the resource that was affected was their water supply and their fish and their source of employment. And then the solutions are specific to each of those. Probably worthwhile taking this table down, maybe on the very back pages of your notes, that's blank there, or on page 71 there's space to take this down, because you'll need to be able to refer to this when we talk about the different questions. So can you please take this down on an A4 page or somewhere within your booklet, and we'll discuss the questions next time round.